What's up, everybody? As you can see, I've got glitter all over myself because I went to Pride this afternoon. I marched with the bisexual contingent um, today, and it was a lot of fun. Met a lot of good people, and just had a really good time marching in Pride. So, um, anyway, let's get into what this video is going to be about. So, I watched Gary Edwards' response to me. I would have made a response sooner, but I had to get ideas and stuff together, and then I went on vacation. So I think it's been about 2-3 weeks, something like that. So, but anyway, it was typical to me. Just more faux objective, fragile, white male trite, full of misconceptions on what intersectionality is, how to apply it to feminist praxis, appeals to authority via that most scientists line. And he says that without any data to back it up, by the way. And condescension, and just more doubling down on utilizing philosophy to justify his half-assed feminism. I've realized during this whole thing that there's a fundamental misunderstanding on what intersectionality means and entails, along with a disdain for qualitative analysis within sociology. So I wonder how Gary and all the other egalitarians in my comment section who were just frothing at the mouth to tell me how wrong and dumb I was and all that, I wonder how they would all measure for injustice, since to them only a qualitative analysis is a no-no because, of strong emergence. I'd also make a request for data that proves that measuring injustice and inequalities with a colorblind universalist perspective, which are both subjective, therefore they're biases, by the way. How measuring inequality with a colorblind perspective is much more superior to taking race, class, and gender into account. But I'm not going to hold my breath for any of that. So let's just get into what intersectionality really is. The term was created by Black legal scholar Kimberly Crenshaw in her essay, Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex in 1989, I believe. Intersectionality is the concept of how various types of oppression interact and interconnect, and how it's difficult to examine one and not the other. It also posits that oppressions don't act independently of each other. They interrelate, creating a much more complex system. When it comes to anti-racist and feminist praxis, taking into account aspects of a person's identity like ethnicity and social station, and how those aspects influence the type of struggle a person has, serves to further illuminate the types of oppression a person endures, and gives activists knowledge that can be used to advance their praxis for reform. For example, if one says that in the United States, men are the oppressors and women are the oppressed, while there is truth in that statement, it lacks nuance and intersectionality via race and class. The statement doesn't take into account that while white women are oppressed via sexism from white and non-white men, white women oppress black men and black women and other men and women of color via racism. Also, a middle class or rich white woman has much more class privilege than working class white people and working class people of color. This is why when the bourgeois white women tried to recruit working class women into the feminist movement via the liberation via working message, working class women weren't rushing to join in. They have always had to work to support themselves and their families, and the conditions under which they had to work weren't liberating. When trying to recruit working class women of color, bourgeois white feminists ran into difficulty because while intraracial sexism and misogyny did and still does exist, women of color, especially black women, were very hesitant to quote unquote turn on their fathers, brothers, and husbands, their partners in racist struggle, a struggle that bourgeois white women and feminists most of the time were quite complicit in perpetuating. An example of that is when northern white feminists wanted to bring more women into the movement, instead of building true solidarity with black feminists, they instead bartered and catered to racist white southern feminists and didn't hold them accountable for their racism and denying black feminists a seat at the table. Also, iconic white feminists like Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony, angered that black men got the right to vote before them and other middle and upper class white women via the 15th Amendment, adopted anti-black narratives in their actions and efforts to garner support for the 19th Amendment, all while expecting working class women to do the legwork and to be the attack dogs on the ground for protests, while middle class white feminists take the credit for their hard work. I was going to say women of color as well, but Stanton and Anthony really didn't give a damn about women of color. So, hell, I mean, the most recent examples of questionable race bullshit within feminism was Patricia Arquette's comments after her acceptance speech on the Oscars. Only a person who is so ignorant of the contributions of women of color to the feminist movement and with blinders to the history of racism within the feminist movement would say the things Arquette said. This is what I mean by lived experiences. Low wages with long work hours, living in government-sanctioned squalor thanks to things like class designation, gerrymandering, redlining, white flight, Jim Crow, etc. Not feelings and emotions. Kimberly Crenshaw's original intent for intersectionality was to show that a feminism and anti-racism movement with one dominant group as the standard focus or the default is a hollow and incomplete movement. Now, feminism has always had a race problem. Always. The second wave didn't solve it, and the third wave isn't solving it either. Being intersectional breaks this archetype of middle-class white women and their issues being the default mortar holding feminism together, because feminists are not just middle-class women and they are not just white women. Intersectionality doesn't mean, an oppressed person is automatically right whenever they have a dispute with a white man, which is basically how Gary and everyone else who agrees with him interpret it. Hence that whole, black woman's know-how line that he threw out there. But more on that a little later. Intersectionality is a mechanism through which anyone, whether they're an activist or not, can utilize to further broaden their knowledge about the world and people around them. Now, I've seen this dislike of qualitative analysis via detailed personal experiences expressed not just by Gary, but the majority of people who commented on my video. It seems like basically only hard quantitative analysis can give us the truth or objective truth. and that, you know, Western civilization is post-racial, aka race doesn't matter anymore, and neither does gender, even in the face of the things that have been going on in the West, most specifically in the United States, where I live. Given the rash of killings of Black men, women, and children by the police, the gutting of the Voting Rights Act, the continued attacks on women's reproductive rights, the killing of 9 Black people by a white supremacist domestic terrorist at a historically Black church in Charleston, South Carolina, as well as the rising cost of living in cities like New York and DC, and along with gentrification forcing people to leave communities which have been their home for years, I don't even have to go into the issues within mainstream feminism to call bullshit on those who have a post-racial, colorblind, quote-unquote egalitarian view on the world. Because at that point, it really comes down to arguing about centuries of established facts. And I'm no longer interested in humoring those types of conversations and points of view. Racism and sexism are still problems in the world, not just in the United States, the world. I will no longer waste my time debating those facts. Our physical appearances and features have always affected the way we as human beings see and interact with each other, and that will most likely always be the case. Yes, there have been strides, great strides, to better our society, and the end of chattel slavery, the suffrage, civil rights, gay rights, and women's rights movements have helped greatly in this regard. It is outright fallacious to posit that things like ethnicity and gender no longer matter. So where does this need to be colorblind and push this false narrative come from? You know, especially with people like Gary. Why did he get in his feelings so much to the point of dismissing established facts as just bad science or magical or, my favorite, Black woman's know-how? Because his racial comfort and illusion of objectivity when looking at the world was threatened by my words. So he lashed out in a condescending tone in his response to me, which is a clear-cut sign of white fragility. Now, white fragility is a state in which even the slightest bit of racial stress becomes intolerable, causing a white person to act in a myriad of defensive ways, including argumentation. By sharing my perspective and stating that Gary's worldview is, in fact, coming from a racialized frame of reference via taking a colorblind universalist stance, because as a white man, he has been taught to view his perspective as objective and representative of most, if not all, human experience and reality, he lashed out at me, throwing out philosophical terms to look smarter for his audience and to reestablish his racial comfort. And thinking that all people have the same realities is a subjective point of view, not an objective one. And while, yes, I know we are all the same species, Homo sapiens sapien, but applying a universalist perspective to race/ethnicity is not only logically fallacious, but racist in itself, as it ignores and denies the significance racism still has on society today. 50 to 60 years of civil rights movement isn't enough to undo centuries of oppression, and the stagnation of anti-racist and feminist movement is proof of that. Acting as if non-white feminists have or have had the same exact experiences and reality as white feminists is not only nonsensical, but racist via colorblindness, and it shows that for all his throwing around philosophical vocabulary, Gary Edwards and those like him don't have the stamina to handle conversations about race, ethnicity, and racist issues. Because nobody ever wants to believe that they contribute to a system that harms others in any way, for one, and they can't fathom that there are things that they will not fully understand because they haven't lived them and experienced them. In fact, even saying something like that gets white men like Gary and Phil Mason in their feelings, and they're ready to dismiss the things that have great impact on your life as just Black women's know-how, just for rightly stating that they'll never fully understand something because they haven't experienced it. Yet by utilizing philosophy or science, as
Thunderfoot does, to ignore the realities of other people and push a colorblind, gender-blind perspective, Gary and others like him only help to perpetuate the racist and sexist status quo, not to eradicate it. Running away from or pretending as if certain problems don't exist don't solve said problems. And only people of privileged mindsets or unempathic mindsets behave in this way.
So I will no longer go out of my way to engage people who choose to ignore reality when it doesn't match up with whatever idealistic shit they've created in their own minds. White supremacy, white privilege, and white fragility are established facts. These aren't concepts that are up for discussion as to whether or not they exist. And I'm not going to entertain those types of discussions anymore. I'm not going to entertain discussions on whether or not feminism has a race problem, because it's always had a race problem. And white stream, excuse me, I said white stream, I mean white mainstream feminism is still too chicken shit to actually address racism within feminism. And until it does, until it really acknowledges that feminism is not just about the perspective of white women, since, you know, white women's perspectives aren't the default experience for all women, there will still be problems. And if there's one thing that will help make a difference, is when people just stop being part of the problem.